Morgue workers, what paranormal moments have you experienced? Story 1. You'd think working in a morgue would toughen you up, right? Well, one night, around 2 a.m., I was doing paperwork when I heard a loud thud from one of the storage drawers. My first thought was, it's just the fridge acting up. But then it happened again, followed by a faint scratching noise. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and pulled open the drawer. Inside was a body bag. The scratching stopped the second I unzipped it. I stared at the face of a recently deceased man. Then his eyes snapped open. I jumped back, barely stopping myself from screaming. Turns out, he wasn't dead. He was in some deep state of catalepsy. The EMTs had called it too soon. We rushed him to the ER, where he miraculously woke up and asked, "Where am I?" To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't opened that drawer. Story 2. When you work in a morgue, the dead don't usually surprise you. But one night, I got my lesson in humility. I was prepping a body for embalming when the overhead lights started flickering. Annoying, but not unusual in old buildings. I kept working until the light suddenly shut off completely. Great. I grabbed my phone for light and turned back to the body, except it wasn't in the same position anymore. The head was tilted. I froze, phone shaking in my hand. Then I heard a low creak and the gurney moved. I bolted from the room, leaving everything behind. Security cameras later showed me something horrifying. The body sat upright for a split second, then collapsed back down. No one has explained it since. Story 3. People ask if morgue work is spooky, and I usually laugh it off. But this one night changed everything. A middle-aged man had passed suddenly at home, and his body was brought in late. I was alone, signing him into our system, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The security monitor showed a shadow passing by the hallway. I called out, thinking maybe a janitor was nearby, but got no reply. Curious, I stepped out and looked. The hallway was empty, but as I turned to go back, I heard whispering. Faint, like it was coming from the walls. I checked every room but found nothing. When I returned to the man's body, I swear his mouth was slightly open, like he'd been mid-sentence. The whisper stopped after I left the morgue. Coincidence? Maybe, but I never worked the night shift again. Story 4. Working alone in a morgue isn't as creepy as people think, until it is. One Friday night, I was finishing up some autopsy notes when I heard footsteps upstairs. Odd, since I was the only one there. I went to check, thinking maybe security was doing rounds. As I climbed the stairs, the footsteps stopped. The air felt heavier, colder. I reached the top and found nothing. But as I turned to go back, I saw something on the landing. A single handprint smeared on the wall, dripping wet. It hadn't been there before. Freaked out, I ran back downstairs. Later, I checked the cameras. There was no record of anyone entering, but in one clip, I saw myself. Behind me, just for a second, was the faint outline of a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. I still don't know who or what it was. Story 5. One night, a young woman's body came in. She'd been in a car accident. Nothing unusual in my line of work. I started cleaning her up, and something strange happened. The clock on the wall stopped ticking, dead silent. Then the room got unbearably cold. I looked up, and the woman's eyes were open, wide open, except they weren't her real eyes. The glassy sheen told me she was still gone. As I moved closer, a loud bang came from the door, like someone was trying to break in. I ran to check, but no one was there. When I turned back, the woman's mouth had twisted into what I can only describe as a smirk. The clock started ticking again, and the temperature returned to normal. I finished my shift, but I'll never forget that smirk. It felt like she knew something I didn't. Story 6. It was a quiet night in the morgue. Until it wasn't. Around midnight, the power flickered, which wasn't unusual, given how old the building was. But then I heard a soft humming. At first, I thought it was the ventilation system acting up, but it sounded too melodic, like someone was singing a lullaby. The sound was coming from the storage room, where I just placed an older man's body. I opened the door, and the humming stopped. The room was silent, but the body bag was unzipped. I knew I hadn't left it that way. Nervously, I zipped it back up, trying to convince myself I'd just made a mistake. But as I turned to leave, the humming started again, louder this time. It was coming from the bag. I bolted, leaving the lights on and the door wide open. Security footage later showed the bag moving slightly, but no one was in the room. I still hear that humming in my nightmares. Story 7. One of my strangest nights on the job started with a seemingly routine autopsy. The man was in his 60s, no family listed, no known medical history. As I began the procedure, the lights flickered and then cut out completely. I stood there in pitch darkness, fumbling for my flashlight. When I finally got it on, the body was gone. For a moment, I thought I was losing it. But then I saw the bloody handprint on the door. My heart nearly stopped. I called security, and we searched the entire building, but there was no sign of the body. Eventually, I checked the cameras. What I saw still haunts me. The man sat up, looked straight into the camera, and smiled before walking out of view. The body was never found. Story 8. They say some places hold on to energy, and I think the morgue is one of them. One night, we received the body of a young boy who had drowned. I couldn't shake the sadness of it. So much life ahead of him, gone in an instant. As I worked, I heard a faint giggle, like a child's laughter, echoing through the room. I froze, telling myself it was just my imagination. Then one of the overhead lights started flickering, and I felt a cold draft sweep past me. When I looked down, the boy's hand had shifted. It was now resting on his chest, though I'd left it by his side. My hands were shaking as I moved it back. As I turned to leave, I swear I heard the giggle again, followed by a soft whisper. "Thank you." Story 9. It was supposed to be a regular shift, nothing out of the ordinary. But when a Jane Doe came in, things got weird fast. The woman had no ID, no belongings, nothing to identify her. Her expression was peaceful, almost like she was asleep. As I was about to close the storage drawer, I noticed her finger twitch. I stepped back, unsure of what I'd just seen. Then her eyes snapped open. Before I could react, she sat up and whispered, "They're coming." My heart felt like it stopped. Then just as suddenly, she collapsed back into the drawer. Paramedics confirmed she was dead. No pulse, no signs of life. To this day, I don't know who they are, but I'm not sticking around to find out. Story 10. Late one night, I was alone, logging some new arrivals. One body caught my attention. A man in his 40s with a strange tattoo covering his chest. It looked ancient, like something out of a history book, with symbols I didn't recognize. As I examined it closer, the tattoo seemed to shift under the light, almost like it was moving. I blinked, thinking I was overtired, but then I heard a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. The growl grew louder, and suddenly the tattoo seemed to glow faintly. The man's body started to convulse, his mouth twisting into a horrific grin. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. When I worked up the courage to return, everything was normal. No glow, no movement. But I transferred him out first thing the next morning. Whatever was attached to him, I didn't want it sticking around. Story 11. When you work in a morgue, you learn to deal with silence. But one night, silence was the last thing I got. I was cataloging a body, an elderly woman who'd passed away in her sleep, when the radio in the corner crackled to life. Static poured out, followed by a faint voice. It sounded garbled, like someone trying to speak underwater. I turned the radio off, thinking it was interference, but the static started again. This time the voice was clearer. It said, "Help me." My stomach dropped. I turned to the body, and for a split second, her lips moved. I froze, convinced my mind was playing tricks. Then the radio cut out entirely, and the room went dead quiet. I tried to shake it off and finish my work, but the voice still haunts me. I never turned that radio on again. Story 12. A few months ago, we got a body that everyone in the morgue talked about. He was a man in his 30s, found alone in a locked apartment. No signs of foul play, but something about him felt off. That night, I was working late, organizing files, when I heard the distinct sound of breathing. It was soft and labored, like someone struggling for air. The noise was coming from the body. I stood there, paralyzed, as the breathing grew louder. Then it stopped abruptly. I walked over to the body, heart racing, and noticed condensation on the inside of the bag, like someone had been breathing in there. When I unzipped it, the man's eyes were wide open, staring right at me. He didn't move, didn't blink. I called for help, but by the time anyone else arrived, his eyes were shut again. No one believed me. Story 13. They say the dead can't hurt you, but I'm not so sure anymore. One night, a body was brought in, a man who had been struck by lightning. As I prepped him, the lights began to flicker. I muttered something about the crappy wiring, but then the lights went out completely. The room was pitch black, and I felt the air grow heavy. Suddenly, a blinding flash lit up the room, like a bolt of lightning had struck right there. When the power came back on, the body was gone. I panicked, thinking maybe I was hallucinating. But when I checked the cameras, the footage showed something terrifying. The man sat up, looked straight at the camera, and then disappeared in another flash of light. I don't know if he left or something took him. Story 14. It was a quiet Tuesday night, and I had just finished my rounds. One of the bodies, a young woman in her 20s, was scheduled for an autopsy the next morning. As I walked past her drawer, I noticed it was slightly ajar. That was strange, considering I'd closed it earlier. I pushed it shut, but as I turned away, I heard the faint sound of crying. I stopped, thinking maybe it was coming from outside, but the sound grew louder and more desperate. It was coming from inside the drawer. My hands shook as I opened it again, but the crying stopped. Her face looked peaceful, almost serene, but her cheeks were wet, as if she'd been crying. I closed the drawer and didn't check it again until morning. No one else believed me when I told them, but I'll never forget the sound of her sobs. Story 15. I used to think ghosts weren't real, until that one night. A man's body came in after a car accident. His injuries were bad, but his face was untouched, eerily calm. As I prepped him, I felt a strange chill, like someone was standing right behind me. I turned, but no one was there. Then I noticed the body's fingers twitching. My rational side said it was just muscle contractions, but then his arm moved, slowly reaching towards me. I jumped back, knocking over my tools. His eyes opened, and he whispered, "It wasn't my fault." I bolted from the room and didn't go back until morning. When I checked the cameras, I saw it clearly. The man sat up, said those words, and then fell back into place. I don't know what he meant, and I'm not sure I want to find out. Story 16. I always told myself the morgue was the safest place. You can't get hurt by the dead, right? One night, I was working late when I noticed something strange. A man's body had come in earlier that evening, and he had a ring on his finger that glinted under the harsh light. I swear I saw the ring twist, like it was moving on its own. I leaned closer, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but then I felt it. A cold breath against my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. When I turned back to the body, the ring was gone. I checked the floor, the gurney, even his hand. It had completely vanished. The next morning, a coworker asked if I'd seen a ring lying around. Apparently, the man's family reported it missing. I didn't say a word. Story 17. Late one night, I was alone, cleaning up after an autopsy. A body, a middle-aged woman, was still on the table, waiting to be moved to storage. As I washed my hands, I heard a faint humming, almost like someone singing. I stopped, listening, but the sound faded. Shrugging it off, I went to move her body, only to find her eyes open. I froze, staring at her. She was definitely dead. No pulse, no breathing, but her lips twitched like she was trying to speak. I stood there, paralyzed, until the humming started again. It was louder this time, coming from her. I ran out of the room and didn't go back until my shift was over. Whatever song she was humming, it wasn't meant for the living. Story 18. We got a Jane Doe one night, a woman found in the woods. Her body was covered in strange, ritualistic symbols carved into her skin. It was unsettling, but I'd seen weird cases before. As I began documenting her injuries, the room temperature dropped, and my breath became visible. The lights dimmed, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Then I noticed something horrifying. The symbols on her body were bleeding. Fresh blood was oozing out, as though the wounds had just been made. I backed away, unsure of what to do, when the gurney shook violently, nearly tipping over. I hit the emergency button, but by the time anyone arrived, everything was normal. No blood, no movement. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I won't forget those symbols. Story 19. One night, a body came in. A man who'd been missing for weeks, finally found in a lake. His skin was pale, bloated, and cold to the touch. As I worked, I noticed something odd. His face seemed to change. At first, I thought it was just the lighting, but then his expression shifted, subtly but unmistakably. His lips curled into a faint smile, and his eyelids twitched. My hands froze mid-task, and I just stared, waiting for something to happen. Then his chest rose, like he was taking a breath. I stumbled back, knocking over my tools, but when I looked again, he was completely still. Security footage later showed the same thing. His face moved, but no one could explain how or why. I've never worked with drowning victims the same way since. Story 20. It started as a normal shift, until we got a body in from a house fire. The man's body was charred, almost unrecognizable, but his eyes were intact. They stared up at the ceiling, unblinking. As I prepared him for examination, the lights flickered, and I smelled something burning. I checked around, thinking maybe it was my equipment, but everything was fine. Then the smell grew stronger, acrid and choking. Suddenly, I heard a voice, low, raspy, and angry. It said, "Why didn't you save me?" I froze, heart pounding. But when I looked at the body, nothing had changed. Except now, his lips were slightly parted, and the burning smell was gone. I didn't stay in that room any longer than I had to. Whatever happened, I'm convinced that man wasn't ready to leave. Story 21. One night, we received the body of an older man who had died at home. Everything seemed routine until I began to prepare him for storage. As I positioned his hands, I felt resistance, like his muscles were tensing. Post-mortem rigidity, I thought, trying to stay calm. But then his hand gripped mine. I yanked my hand back, heart racing, but his fingers stayed curled, as if he was holding something. Then the lights flickered, and I heard a low groan. It wasn't mechanical, it was coming from the body. I stepped back, and as I did, his head tilted slightly toward me. I called for help, but by the time anyone arrived, his body was completely still again. They laughed it off, but I don't touch the hands anymore unless I absolutely have to. Story 22. We had a body come in from a hit and run. Young guy, maybe in his 20s. His injuries were severe, but his face was untouched. As I began cleaning him up, I noticed his eyes were slightly open. I tried to close them, but they wouldn't stay shut. Every time I looked away, they'd open again, just enough to catch the light and make it seem like he was staring at me. Then, as I turned to grab a tool, I heard a whisper. "It wasn't an accident." My skin went cold. I checked the room, convinced someone was messing with me, but I was alone. When I looked back at the body, his eyes were finally closed. I've always wondered if he was trying to tell me something. Story 23. A few months ago, we got a body that I still can't explain. A woman in her 30s had been found in an abandoned house, no signs of trauma or foul play. As I documented her belongings, I noticed a strange necklace, a small vial filled with dark red liquid. It looked like blood, but I wasn't sure. As soon as I touched it, the room grew cold and the lights dimmed. Then I heard a faint heartbeat. I checked the monitors, but they were off. The heartbeat grew louder, and the vial in my hand felt warm. I put it back on her chest, and everything stopped. The air warmed, and the lights brightened. I've never been superstitious, but I refused to touch that necklace again. Story 24. One late shift, I was alone in the morgue, organizing files, when I heard a loud bang. It came from the autopsy room. My first thought was that someone had dropped something, but I was alone. I walked in cautiously and saw that one of the drawers was wide open. The body inside was a man who'd passed away earlier that week. The strange part? His body was halfway out, like he'd tried to crawl out of the drawer. I pushed him back in, but as I did, I felt something grab my arm. I screamed and jumped back, but when I looked, his hand was limp. Security footage later showed the drawer sliding open on its own, but no one believed what I felt. Story 25. We once received the body of a woman who had been struck by lightning. Her skin had strange tree-like patterns running down her arms and chest, and her hair was scorched. As I prepared her for an autopsy, I noticed an odd static-like hum in the air. My hair stood on end, and every time I touched her, I felt a faint shock. It was annoying but harmless, so I kept working. Then, as I reached for a scalpel, I felt a jolt so strong it knocked the tool out of my hand. Her body twitched violently, and the hum grew louder. I backed away, and suddenly, her eyes opened, glowing faintly blue. She stared straight at me, and I swear her lips moved, though no sound came out. Then, just as quickly, everything stopped. The hum, the glow, the movement. I finished the shift, but I couldn't look her in the eyes again. Story 26. A man in his 40s was brought in after collapsing at a local park. No signs of trauma, nothing unusual. As I prepared to log him in, I noticed his hand was clenched into a tight fist. I tried to open it, thinking maybe he'd been holding something, but his fingers wouldn't budge. That's when I noticed a faint bruise on his wrist, almost like a bite mark. I ignored it and moved on. But later, as I stepped out for coffee, I heard a loud crash from the storage area. I ran back to find his drawer slightly open, and his hand, now unclenched, was hanging out, fingers stretched toward the floor. The bite mark had vanished. I locked up early that night and didn't check the cameras. I didn't want to see what happened. Story 27. One stormy night a body came in, a man who drowned during a freak flood. As I cleaned his skin, I noticed tiny cuts all over his arms, like scratches. They weren't listed in the report, which was odd. As I examined them closer, water started dripping from his mouth. Not blood, not bile, just clear water. I wiped it away, but it kept coming, as though he was still drowning. Then, I heard a faint gurgling noise, like someone struggling to breathe. It grew louder, and suddenly the room felt like it was flooding. My shoes were soaked, and the air was heavy with the smell of river water. Panicked, I ran out, but when I returned, the floor was dry, and the body was completely still. The scratches, though, were gone. Story 28. We once received a woman in her 80s who had passed peacefully in her sleep. She looked serene, almost like she was just napping. As I began to log her in, I noticed her fingers twitching. I reminded myself it was normal. Muscle contractions happen post-mortem. But then she sat up. Just sat up, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. I froze, unsure if I should call for help or bolt. After a few seconds, she slowly lay back down, her eyes still open. When I checked her pulse, there was nothing. The next morning, her family mentioned she had always joked about scaring people after she passed. I still wonder if that was her way of following through. Story 29. A young man came in after a motorcycle accident. His injuries were brutal, but his helmet had kept his face intact. I was cataloging his personal items when I heard a sharp knock on the autopsy room door. Thinking it was security, I went to check, but no one was there. When I turned back, his helmet, which I'd placed on the counter, was on the floor, rolling in a slow circle. My heart sank. As I picked it up, I heard faint whispers, like someone talking through static. I placed the helmet back and stepped away. The whispers stopped. I finished my shift as fast as I could, but I still avoid motorcycles to this day. Story 30. One evening, I was alone in the morgue when we received a body from a psychiatric facility. The man had died after claiming he was possessed. The report mentioned he'd clawed at his chest before passing, leaving deep scratches. As I prepped him, I noticed his face had a strange, twisted grin. I brushed it off as rigor mortis and continued working. But as I stepped away, I heard a low growl. It wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from him. I stared, waiting for something to happen, and then his mouth opened. A puff of black smoke, or maybe mist, escaped, and the growl stopped. The grin faded from his face, and he looked completely normal. I didn't tell anyone about it, but I transferred him out as quickly as I could. Whatever left him that night wasn't something I wanted sticking around. Story 31. A body came in late one night. A man who had been hiking and was found dead at the base of a cliff. No foul play, just a tragic accident. As I began cleaning him up, I noticed something strange. His fingernails were caked with dirt and fur? It looked like animal fur, but there were no reports of an animal attack. As I inspected further, the room suddenly felt colder, and I heard a faint growl coming from nowhere in particular. I brushed it off, but then his body shifted slightly. I froze, staring at him, and that's when I saw it. A deep scratch down his side that hadn't been there when he came in. It looked fresh, as though it had just been made. I stepped back, and the growl grew louder. The next morning, the scratch was gone, and I didn't stick around to ask questions. Story 32. We once received a Jane Doe who had drowned in a lake. Her file noted that she'd been underwater for weeks before being found. As I prepared her for storage, I noticed her hair was still wet and dripping. I thought it was odd, since she'd been cleaned up before arriving. I wiped the water away, but it kept coming, forming small puddles on the table. Then I heard the faint sound of water splashing, like someone wading through a pool. The sound got louder, and the air around me felt damp and cold. When I turned back, her hand had moved, hanging off the side of the gurney. I left the room and didn't return until morning. When I did, the puddles were gone, but her hair was still wet. Story 33. One night we got the body of a man who had passed away in his sleep. He had no history of health problems, no obvious cause of death. As I logged him into the system, I noticed a slight smile on his face. It was odd, but not unheard of. Then, as I was closing the drawer, I heard a faint chuckle. I stopped, my hand hovering over the handle, and listened. It happened again. A low, raspy laugh. I quickly opened the drawer, but the body was still. I told myself I was just tired and finished my shift, but when I checked the footage later, the sound had been caught on the camera's mic. To this day, I can't explain it. Story 34. A woman in her 50s was brought in after collapsing at her home. As I prepared her for the autopsy, I noticed a strange mark on her neck. A small, circular bruise. It wasn't mentioned in the report, so I took a closer look. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered, and I felt a sharp sting on my own neck, like a needle. I touched the spot, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at her, the bruise on her neck was gone. My hands started shaking, and I backed away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I finished her report as fast as possible, and avoided that room for weeks. Story 35. One night, a body came in. A teenager who had passed away after a long illness. Her family had left her with a stuffed animal, a small bear with a worn-out bow. I placed it beside her as I worked, but every time I turned away, it seemed to move. First, it was lying flat. Then, it was sitting up. I thought I was imagining things until I picked it up and felt something warm, like it had been held. As I stared at it, the room filled with a faint, childlike humming. I looked at the body, and her lips seemed to twitch, as if she were smiling. I left the morgue early that night, but I could still hear the humming in my ears as I drove home. I didn't tell her family about it, but I couldn't bring myself to move the bear again. Story 36. A body came in late. An older man who had died suddenly in his home. As I was prepping him, I noticed his hand was gripping something tightly. It took some effort to pry his fingers open, and when I did, I found an old worn photograph of a woman. The odd part? Her face was scratched out. I placed the photo on the counter and kept working. That's when I heard a faint tapping. At first I thought it was coming from the window, but then I realized it was coming from inside the storage drawer. I opened it, and the man's eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. I slammed the drawer shut and left the room. When I returned, the photograph was gone. Story 37. One night, a young woman's body came in after a car accident. Her file noted she'd been wearing a wedding dress when she died, which felt especially tragic. I placed her belongings in a bag, but as I picked up the dress, I felt an odd warmth, like it had just come out of the dryer. I brushed it off and hung it up. Later, as I passed by the storage room, I saw a shadow through the frosted glass. It looked like someone wearing a long gown. When I opened the door, the room was empty, but the dress was lying on the floor, perfectly spread out, as if someone had been standing in it. I locked the room and didn't go back that night. Story 38. A man in his 30s came in after a workplace accident. He had a reputation around town for being superstitious and always carried a small wooden charm in his pocket. As I logged his belongings, I picked up the charm and felt a strange pulse run through my hand. It wasn't electrical. It felt alive. I set it down, but the pulse lingered in my fingers. When I returned to his body, I noticed his eyes were slightly open, though they'd been closed before. I closed them again, but they wouldn't stay shut. Later, I found the charm back in his pocket, though I was sure I'd placed it with his belongings. I didn't touch it again. Story 39. We received the body of a man who had been struck by a train. His injuries were severe, but his ID and wallet were untouched. As I catalogued his belongings, I found a train ticket in his wallet for a route that didn't exist anymore. The ticket was dated 20 years ago, the exact day he died. I showed it to a co-worker, and he shrugged it off as a mistake. That night, as I walked past the body, I heard the faint sound of a train whistle. The sound grew louder, and the lights flickered. When they came back on, the body was gone. The next morning, it was back in the drawer, but the ticket had disappeared. Story 40. One of the creepiest nights I've ever had started with a routine case. A middle-aged woman who'd passed away in her sleep. Everything seemed normal until I noticed her toes were covered in dirt, as if she'd been walking barefoot outside. This was odd, since she'd been found in bed. As I cleaned her feet, I felt a sharp pain in my own. When I looked down, the soles of my shoes were covered in mud, though the floor was spotless. Then I heard faint footsteps behind me. I turned, but no one was there. When I looked back at her, her head was tilted toward me, her lips slightly parted, as if she was about to speak. I didn't wait to find out what she might say. Story 41. We once got a body from a man who had been lost at sea for weeks before washing ashore. His skin was pale and wrinkled, like he'd been submerged for far too long. As I prepared him, I noticed something odd. His fingers looked like they were gripping something. I gently pried them open and found nothing but deep indentations in his palm, as if he'd been holding onto a rope or chain. Suddenly, I felt a splash of cold water hit my arm. I looked around, but there was no source, no leaks, no spilled fluids. Then I heard it, the sound of waves crashing. The room was silent a second ago, but now it felt like I was standing on a beach. When I turned back to the body, his lips had curled into a faint, eerie smile. Story 42. A woman in her 60s was brought in after a suspected heart attack. Everything about her case seemed routine, except for one thing. Her right hand was clutching a small black notebook. It was old and weathered, with no visible writing on the cover. When I opened it, the pages were blank, but my nose filled with the scent of smoke, strong and acrid, like something burning. Suddenly the lights flickered, and I heard a loud snap, like a branch breaking. The notebook fell from my hands and landed open, and now the pages weren't blank anymore. There was one sentence written across the middle. Don't look. I shut the book and put it back with her belongings. I never opened it again. Story 43. Late one night, I was working on a man who had been struck by lightning. His body was charred, but oddly enough, his eyes were clear and unclouded, like he was still alive. As I moved closer, I felt a strange static charge in the air, like the hum before a storm. Suddenly, his hand twitched, then his chest jerked up as if he'd been shocked. I stumbled back, heart racing. When I looked again, he was still. But the static in the room didn't fade. My hair stood on end the rest of the night, and every time I touched metal, I felt a sharp jolt. I've avoided lightning cases ever since. Story 44. A teenager's body came in one rainy night. He'd been hit by a car while crossing a bridge. As I logged his belongings, I noticed a soggy folded piece of paper in his pocket. When I opened it, I saw a drawing of a figure standing on the bridge, staring down into the water. The odd part? The figure didn't look like him. It was taller and had long dark hair. I placed the paper aside and continued working, but every so often, I felt a cold breeze, like someone was standing behind me. When I finally turned around, there was nothing there, but the paper had disappeared. The next morning, I found it tucked back in his pocket. Story 45. We got a body from a man who had been a local recluse. The police found him surrounded by clocks, all stopped at exactly 3:03 a.m. As I prepped him for storage, I heard a faint ticking sound. It was subtle at first, almost like it was in my head. But then it grew louder, until it sounded like the whole room was filled with ticking clocks. I looked at the man's face, and for a brief second, I thought I saw his lips move. The ticking stopped, and the air went still. When I checked the clock on the wall, it was stuck on 3:03. It didn't start working again until his body was transferred out the next day. Story 46. We received the body from a nursing home. An elderly woman who had passed peacefully in her sleep. As I prepared her for storage, I noticed a delicate gold locket around her neck. When I opened it, I saw two photos, one of a young woman and another of a man in a military uniform. Nothing unusual, except when I placed the locket back, I felt a cold, firm grip on my wrist. Startled, I looked down, but her hands hadn't moved. I quickly finished and walked away, but as I stepped into the hallway, I felt the same icy grip on my other wrist. The sensation didn't fade until I placed the locket into her personal belongings. That night, I heard faint whispers, but when I checked the cameras, the room was empty. Story 47. A man in his 40s was brought in after a workplace explosion. His body was badly burned, but his left eye was intact and eerily clear. As I moved his body to the gurney, I thought I saw the eye blink. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but then it moved, following me as I walked across the room. I froze, staring back at him, when I heard a faint voice whisper, "Get out." The voice was low, raspy, and unmistakably coming from his direction. I finished my work as quickly as possible and avoided that room for the rest of the night. Story 48. One stormy night, we received the body of a woman who had drowned in a flood. As I began logging her belongings, I noticed a small, waterlogged book clutched in her hand. The pages were too damaged to read, but as I flipped through them, I heard the faint sound of dripping water, louder than it should have been. When I turned back to her body, her lips were parted, and a thin stream of water was flowing from her mouth onto the floor. I stepped back, horrified, but the water kept coming. It stopped only when I placed the book back into her hand. I didn't touch it again. Story 49. We received the body of a man who had died while camping in the woods. His file mentioned no signs of trauma, but his face looked frozen in fear. As I prepared him for storage, the lights dimmed, and the air felt heavy. Then I noticed a faint, earthy smell, like damp soil and moss. Suddenly, I heard rustling, like leaves blowing in the wind, though the room was completely still. When I looked down, there were muddy footprints leading away from the gurney. They disappeared before reaching the door, and the smell vanished just as quickly. I didn't sleep well for weeks after that. Story 50. A young woman's body came in after a tragic fall from an apartment building. Her family had sent a music box with her belongings, saying it was her favorite keepsake. As I prepared her, the music box started playing on its own. The melody was haunting, slow, and out of tune. I tried to stop it, but no matter how many times I closed the lid, it kept playing. Then, as I moved her body, I thought I saw her lips twitch, like she was humming along. The music box finally stopped when I placed it beside her. Later, when I went back to clean up, the box was open again, and the melody had changed to something I didn't recognize. I left it where it was and didn't look back. Story 51. We received the body of a young man who had died hiking in the mountains. His file said he'd fallen, but there were no visible injuries on him, just his pale, weathered face frozen in a grimace. As I prepared him, I noticed his hiking boots were caked in fresh dirt. Strange, since his body had been found days ago. I brushed the dirt off, but a faint, earthy scent lingered. Suddenly, The room felt colder, and I heard a faint whistle, like wind rushing through trees. Then I saw it, a shadow moving along the wall, though there was no one else in the room. I backed away, and the whistle grew louder, turning into a deep, guttural growl. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it appeared, and I left the room, shaken. The boots stayed untouched after that. Story 52. One night, a man in his 70s was brought in. His file noted he'd been a famous magician decades ago. As I worked on his body, I noticed his left hand was clenched into a fist. When I finally pried it open, a small key fell out. It was old, ornate, and cold to the touch. I placed it with his belongings, but later, as I passed his drawer, I heard a faint metallic clink. When I opened the drawer, the key was back in his hand. My skin crawled, but I moved it again, placing it in a secure box. The next morning, the key was gone completely, and no one could find it. I still wonder what lock it was meant for. Story 53. We got a body from a car crash, a woman in her 30s. She'd been wearing a long scarf which was badly torn. As I removed it, I noticed deep red marks on her neck, like she'd been strangled. The police report didn't mention anything like that, so I made a note and continued working. Then the scarf fell from the table, and when I bent to pick it up, I felt a sudden, tight pressure around my neck. I gasped, clawing at nothing, and the pressure stopped just as suddenly as it started. When I stood back up, the scarf was hanging from the light fixture, swaying gently, though there was no breeze. I left the room and refused to enter it alone after that. Story 54. One late shift, I was logging in the body of a man who had died at a hospital. He had no belongings except for an old wristwatch, cracked and stopped at 11:11 p.m. As I logged the time of death, my own watch froze. The second hand just stopped, and the room went completely silent. No humming from the fridge, no ticking from the wall clock. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of a clock chiming, though there were no clocks in the room capable of making that sound. The air felt thick, and when I glanced at the body, the man's cracked watch had started ticking again. My own watch resumed the moment I left the room, but I couldn't bring myself to log the time of death correctly. Story 55. A woman in her 40s was brought in after a house fire. Her body was badly burned, but oddly her hands were untouched. They looked pristine, almost like they belonged to someone else. As I examined her, I noticed her fingers were curled tightly around something. When I opened her hand, there was a small piece of charred wood. I placed it on the table and went back to work, but the air grew thick with the smell of smoke. Then I heard it, a faint crackling sound, like fire spreading. I turned to see the piece of wood glowing faintly, as if it were still burning. When I tried to move it, the glow vanished, and so did the sound. The next morning, the wood had turned to ash. I still don't know what it was, but it didn't feel natural. Story 56. A middle-aged man's body arrived late one night. He'd been found sitting upright in his chair at home, with no signs of trauma or foul play. As I prepared him, I noticed something strange. His lips were slightly parted, as if he had been in the middle of speaking when he died. I ignored it and got to work. But then I heard it, a faint whisper. I froze, convinced I was imagining things. But as I leaned closer to the body, I heard it again. "It's not over." My stomach dropped. I stepped back, and the room went silent. Later, when I reviewed the security footage, there was no sound recorded. But for a moment, the man's lips visibly moved. I haven't worked a night shift since. Story 57. We once received the body of a young woman who had drowned at a local beach. She was wearing a silver bracelet engraved with the words, "Never let go." As I examined her, I noticed the room felt humid, and the faint scent of salt water lingered. I chalked it up to the nature of her case, but then her bracelet slipped off her wrist and fell to the floor. When I picked it up, it was warm to the touch, almost like it had been sitting in sunlight. Suddenly, I heard faint, muffled screams, as if someone was underwater. I dropped the bracelet and backed away, but the screams didn't stop until I placed it back on her wrist. Story 58. A man in his 20s was brought in after a fatal fall during a rock climbing trip. His belongings included a small, hand-carved wooden figure of a man with hollow eyes. I set it aside, but every time I glanced at it, I felt like its head had turned slightly. Shrugging it off as paranoia, I continued working. But then I heard a soft tapping sound. The wooden figure had fallen over, but there was no reason for it to move. When I picked it up, it was damp, like it had been left in the rain, even though the room was dry. I locked it in a cabinet and didn't open it again until his case was transferred out. Story 59. A woman in her 70s arrived from a nursing home. Her file said she had passed peacefully in her sleep, but her face was twisted into a grimace, as though she had been screaming. As I prepped her, I noticed scratch marks on her arms, faint but visible. They hadn't been in the report. Then I heard it, the faint sound of nails scratching against wood. I stopped, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to come from all around me. When I glanced back at her body, her hands were curled into fists, though I'd left them flat. The scratches vanished by morning, and I didn't mention them to anyone, but the sound of that scratching still haunts me. Story 60. We received the body of a man who had worked as a watchmaker. His personal effects included an intricate pocket watch, the kind with exposed gears. As I examined his body, the watch began ticking, even though it was broken and the hands hadn't moved in years. I picked it up, and the ticking stopped. When I put it back down, it started again, but louder this time, echoing in the quiet room. Suddenly, the man's hand twitched, and his eyes opened for just a moment before closing again. The ticking stopped completely after that. I left the watch with his belongings and avoided his drawer for the rest of the week. Story 61. One rainy night, a young man's body was brought in after a motorcycle accident. He had been wearing a leather jacket with patches, one of which read, "Live to Ride." As I removed his belongings, I heard the faint sound of an engine revving, distant but clear. I ignored it, thinking it was just my imagination. But as I turned back to his body, I saw a faint smear of grease on the table where his hand rested. The smell of gasoline filled the room, even though there were no sources nearby. Then, I heard a loud crash, like metal hitting concrete, and the sound of screeching tires. When I looked again, his hand had shifted slightly, and the grease was gone. I still avoid the motorcycle cases when I can. Story 62. A woman in her 30s was brought in after a sudden, unexplained death at her home. Among her belongings was an antique mirror, cracked in one corner. As I worked, I noticed the mirror seemed to catch every movement, reflecting things in the room that weren't there. At one point, I swore I saw someone standing behind me in its reflection, but when I turned around, the room was empty. I covered the mirror with a cloth, but the air felt colder, heavier. Later, I found the cloth on the floor, and the cracks in the mirror looked deeper. I left it untouched and made sure it was sent with her belongings. Story 63. We once received the body of a man who had died during a storm. His shoes were soaked and his coat smelled of wet earth. As I examined him, I noticed his socks were caked with mud, even though his file said he'd been found indoors. Then the lights flickered, and I heard a faint squelching sound, like footsteps in mud. I turned to see muddy footprints leading from his gurney to the door. They stopped abruptly, and the room went silent. The footprints were gone by the next morning, but I'll never forget the sound of them. Story 64. A middle-aged woman was brought in after a house fire. Her body was covered in soot, and her hands were clutching a melted candle. I tried to remove the candle, but it seemed fused to her fingers. As I worked, the smell of wax and burnt wood filled the room, even though the air filters were running. Then, the lights dimmed, and I saw a faint flicker of flame near her hand. I grabbed the extinguisher, but when I turned back, the flame was gone. Her fingers, however, were clean. No soot, no candle. I double-checked the file, but it still listed her cause of death as undetermined. Story 65. We received the body from a hiking accident, a man in his late 20s who had fallen from a cliff. His belongings included a notebook filled with sketches of trees, cliffs, and mountains. One page caught my eye, a drawing of a dark figure standing at the edge of a cliff. It was crude but unsettling. As I turned the page, the air grew colder, and I felt a faint pressure on my shoulders, like hands pushing down. When I looked back at the notebook, The figure had moved slightly closer to the edge in the drawing. I locked the notebook away and refused to touch it again. The next morning, the figure was gone entirely. Story 66. We received the body from a man who had been a locksmith. He was found dead in his workshop, surrounded by tools and locks of every size. Among his belongings was a peculiar key, large and ornate, with no markings to indicate what it was for. I placed it on the counter, but as I turned to move his body, I heard a soft click. The key had moved to the edge of the counter, though no one was in the room but me. When I picked it up again, it felt warm, almost like it had been in someone's hand. Later that night, I swore I heard the faint sound of locks turning in the storage room, though none of the drawers were open. I locked the key in a cabinet and never took it out again. Story 67. A young woman's body came in after she had been found at an abandoned carnival. Her report mentioned no signs of trauma, but her hands were sticky, as if she'd been holding cotton candy. I brushed it off and placed her belongings in storage, which included a small clown figurine. As I worked, I noticed the room had grown quieter than usual. No hum from the fridge, no distant footsteps. Then, the clown figurine fell off the table, landing upright on the floor. I picked it up and put it back, but it fell again, this time rolling toward the woman's gurney. Later, as I left the room, I thought I heard faint carnival music, but the building was completely empty. Story 68. One late night, we got the body of a man who had died during a hunting trip. His personal effects included an old rifle and a leather satchel. As I catalogued his items, I noticed a faint metallic smell, like gunpowder. I shrugged it off, but then I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving across the floor behind me. I turned, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the man's body, his fingers were gripping the edge of the gurney, though I'd left his hands folded. The smell of gunpowder lingered the rest of the night, and I avoided touching the satchel again. Story 69. A man in his 60s arrived after a sudden heart attack. His personal effects included an old photograph of a woman, creased and faded from years of handling. As I logged his belongings, the photo slipped from my hand and fluttered to the floor. When I bent to pick it up, I noticed something strange. The woman's face, which had been faintly visible before, was completely blank. I placed the photo back with his items, but as I turned away, I heard a faint voice say, "Where is she?" I checked the cameras later, but there was no sound, only static during the exact moment the voice spoke. Story 70. A teenager's body came in after a freak electrical accident. The file said he had been fixing his family's old radio when it happened. Among his belongings was the radio itself, battered and missing knobs. As I worked, the radio crackled to life, emitting faint static. I assumed it was interference, but then I heard a voice whisper, "It wasn't an accident." My hands froze. The static grew louder, and for a brief moment, the room smelled of burnt wires. I unplugged the radio, but it continued crackling. It finally went silent when I moved it away from the body. I never logged what happened that night. I didn't think anyone would believe me. Story 71. A man's body came in after he was found dead in his workshop. He was a clockmaker, and his belongings included a half-finished clock with ornate golden hands. As I prepped his body, I noticed the faint ticking sound from the clock, even though it wasn't connected to any power source. It grew louder as the night went on, echoing in the quiet room. Then, without warning, the clock chimed. It was sharp, discordant, and completely unnatural. I turned to look at the body and froze. His hand had moved slightly, resting near the edge of the table. The clock stopped the moment I left the room, and I refused to go near it again. Story 72. We received the body of a young woman who had fallen from a rooftop. Her belongings included a scarf, worn and frayed, that had been tied tightly around her neck. As I worked, I felt the room grow colder, and then the scarf began to move on its own, twisting and coiling like it was alive. It fell to the floor, but before I could pick it up, I felt a sudden pressure around my throat, like invisible hands choking me. I backed away, gasping for air, and the pressure stopped. When I looked at the scarf, it was hanging from the edge of the gurney, perfectly still. I left the room and avoided the case for the rest of the night. Story 73. A man was brought in after dying at a construction site. His file mentioned no foul play, but his hands were covered in dried cement, and there was dirt under his nails. As I examined him, I noticed the faint sound of shoveling, rhythmic and steady. It felt like it was coming from the walls. When I checked the cameras, I saw nothing unusual, but the sound persisted, growing louder. Then I looked back at the body and saw fresh dirt on the table, though I hadn't touched him yet. By the time my shift ended, the sound had stopped, but the memory of it stayed with me. Story 74. One stormy night, we got the body of an elderly woman who had lived alone in a crumbling old house. Her belongings included a collection of porcelain dolls, one of which had been placed in her arms when she was found. As I moved the doll to a separate bag, I thought I saw its head turn slightly. I froze, staring at it, but nothing happened. Later, as I worked, I heard the faint sound of giggling, soft and high-pitched, like a child. The doll, which I had placed on a nearby counter, was now lying face down on the floor. No one else was in the room. I locked it away and didn't go near it again. Story 75. We received a body from a boating accident, a man in his late 50s. His belongings included a rusted compass that he'd been holding when he died. As I worked, the compass began spinning wildly, though there was no wind or movement nearby. I set it down, but the spinning didn't stop. Then, I noticed a faint smell of salt water, and the room grew cold, almost damp. When I turned back to the body, his hand had moved, reaching slightly toward the compass. I left it with his belongings and didn't touch it again. The next day, the compass was found in a different part of the morgue, still spinning. No one admitted to moving it.